But what if I were to re-release the same game only a few years apart with only minor changes and sell it again at full price? Ho 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 ho, delightfully devilish, Naughty Dog. The video game industry has changed a lot over the last few years, in both good and bad ways, but one of the most interesting shifts I've seen is their approach when it comes to remakes. This phenomenon has always existed, from the occasional rebuild from the ground up that an arcade release would have when it came to home console, to Super Mario All-Stars, but up until a few years ago, they were something of a rarity. With video game preservation being a larger focus than ever before, more and more companies are making the strange, but not unwelcome decision to fully recreate some of their older work rather than just port it forward, to mixed results. Some, like Resident Evil 2, Super Mario RPG, Demon's Souls, and Black Mesa, released to critical acclaim, whereas others are deemed unnecessary, like The Last of Us Part 1, which already looked and played just fine as it was, or downright considered to be awful imitations of the original, most notably with Warcraft 3 Reforged, and to a much lesser extent, Majora's Mask 3D, though I personally think the latter stands on its own as a great game. But even then, there are so many games that could massively benefit from getting a remake if the devs and executives would just be willing to take a chance and give it another shot. A remake can do so much more than just look pretty. They can fix jankiness, modify outdated control schemes, add additional context or content, or replace questionable material. I've played hundreds of games in my life, and like many of my peers, consider some games, even despite their jank, to be classic staples of my taste in gaming. But a great remake may not necessarily replace the original, but rather offer a different take on the material or exist as a supplement to something that's already great. So I'm sure you're wondering, what games do I think deserve or need a remake?
You know how to use this?
Kinda. I've covered wars, you know.
First up on our list is the one I personally would most like to see. Dead Rising is a more modern favorite for me. Despite being a series almost 2 decades old, I only got into it in the last 4-ish years, and yet it quickly rose to the ranks as one of my favorite series, or at least the first 2 entries in Case West. The game's campy atmosphere and arcade-esque zombie-killing action is some of the most fun I've had in a sandbox game, with a near-perfect balance of memorable boss encounters, unconventional puzzle solving, achievement hunting, and of course, its signature brand of undead dispatch. Pick up anything that isn't nailed to the floor and start swinging. Throw CDs like Shuriken, bowl the living dead over to go for a strike, run them over in a glorious mess of blood and rotten flesh with a lawnmower, or lead the charge with a massive umbrella. But for all the goofy action and survival challenges, the original game has a multitude of issues that could stand ironing out. Boss encounters, while memorable, can be notoriously frustrating at low levels and offer no challenge at higher ones. Certain weapons are straight up broken given the right setup. Otis, who canonically can see what's going on, relentlessly bothers you at the most inopportune times and berates you for hanging up, then starts his conversation over with unskippable dialogue, when the only reason you hung up on him is because you're being eaten alive, and the AI on the survivors, good grief, if there's one reason to remake it, it's these pathetic piles of code. They get confused if you're more than 10 feet away, their pathing doesn't take obstacles or enemies into account, meaning they run mindlessly into hordes of the undead to be slaughtered unless Frank can manage to chop them off without killing the survivor, when they're not running into each other. Half of them never use items even if you give them one, and the other half the time they'll end up hitting you as well, because they certainly won't use them if zombies are within arm's reach, even though that's the ideal time to use them. You'll be lucky to get even half the survivors you escort back if you don't know what you're doing. But a Dead Rising remake, clean up the graphics, fix these issues, and you've got a winner there. But let's go further with it. Add 1 or 2 new places to the mall, add in additional weapons, mixed drinks, psychopath encounters, and survivors to rescue, and maybe slow down the time progression just a bit to account for the new content, and now you've given more bang for the ever devaluing buck on this diamond in the rough. Heck, just for a few more ideas, maybe you could incorporate some of the bosses from Dead Rising 4, which also takes place in Willamette, and give them a chance to shine in a game that isn't hot garbage, aka Dead Rising 4. I'd particularly like to see Captain Black Friday Beard because that name and concept is too funny to stay locked in its original game. Make the Laser Sword and Mega Buster New Game Plus rewards, or maybe even include the weapon combo system from 2. Heck, do both. Make the Capcom Heroes costumes unlockable outfits through achievements so Frank can dress up as Ryu and plow through zombies with a Hadouken, or let him chop till he drops while dressed as Dante or a Monster Hunter. The sky's the limit on what you could do to make Willamette Parkview Mall an even better playground, and turn the game into something even more replayable than it already was meant to be. I'll even give you one extra idea. Maybe in a similar manner to Case West, we could have an alternate mode where Chuck Green is the protagonist instead, prior to meeting his wife and having Katie, to tell an alternate non-canon story. Maybe even have Frank be a psychopath in this one. Case in point, I really love Dead Rising when it's at its best, but have a frustrating migraine at its worst, and I would really love to bring it back into the mainstream again. Just, let's make sure to hire TJ Rolento back, I'd rather Hank East stay dead and buried. Talk about tonal whiplash between the last entry and here, huh? Banjo-Kazooie is a gaming legend in some circles, considered to be one of the pinnacles of both N64 platformers and of the collectathon genre as a whole. A genre that has unfortunately gone by the wayside for the better part of the 21st century. Outside of indie gatherings like Yooka-Laylee or A Hat in Time, trying to recapture the magic of Banjo and his contemporaries, to mixed reception, we haven't really seen anything of this genre for an extremely long time, almost like the gaming industry as a whole has seen it as this outdated thing. The most Banjo's got since the Xbox 360 has been showing up in other companies' games and some merchandise. But with the advent of fellow Scrimblows Crash, Spyro, and even lesser beloved ones like Bubsy, and fellow Collectathon star KO the Kangaroo receiving revivals and remakes of their own, I think we're more than ready to have a remake of Banjo-Kazooie. And if we're feeling frisky, Banjo-Tooie alongside it. But just to be safe, let's start with the first and gauge the interest there. Unlike Dead Rising, Banjo really only needs some touch-ups. The controls are a little janky, most notably when swimming, and hitboxes can seem questionable at times, but the reasons I specifically want Banjo-Kazooie are threefold. First and foremost is just to get them back in the public consciousness. They were must-haves on the 64 and a lesser extent the 360, but ever since Nuts and Bolts they've slowly been drifting away, with them only really being known to the hardcore gamer. Well, and Smash fans, though many of them were already familiar with the characters, if not their game as well. Second, I've seen with Crash and Spyro what these games could look and play like with a modern coat of paint. They're utterly gorgeous and play better than ever before. Imagine the iconic locales like Spiral Mountain, Freezeezy Peak, and Mad Monster Mansion recreated with the graphics of today. Their bright, colorful world could be a joyous wonder to explore. Lastly, and this goes hand in hand with a return to the public eye, if a Banjo remake did well, the possibility of a Banjo 3 goes up exponentially, and likewise, the collectathon genre as a whole could have new life breathed into it. So, Phil, get Toys for Bob out of Call of Duty Hell and have them work on this, pronto. Please?
Are you fucking serious?
Speaking of potential post-acquisition Activision projects, there's a certain fan-favorite licensed game that needs addressing. While I always personally preferred The Simpsons Road Rage, I can't deny the massive outcry of love that people have for Hit and Run, and I can't blame them. A less violent, more cartoony take on GTA's winning formula, set in the sprawling, dysfunctional dystopia of Springfield, is a recipe for success, and with the writing staff and voice talent of the original series helping out, it made for a memorable tie-in and one of the most beloved licensed games of all time. If one filled with bugs and glitches, and one that, despite my personal appreciation for the ugliness, has not exactly aged gracefully in the graphics department, and so I think a remake would do wonders. Licensed games are a rare breed nowadays, unless you're Game Mill Entertainment, and a good one is even more of a rarity. I'd propose a from-the-ground-up remake with an updated art style. Perhaps you could use the cel-shaded look featured in the Simpsons game, as I think that looked pretty solid, and perhaps the animation staff from the actual show could be brought in to do the cutscenes, just like in that game as well. Just make sure those hardworking animators get their due pay. My one hang-up on ever actually expecting this one is the awkward situation around Apu. He was one of the 5 playable characters in the original, and the only non-family member who was playable, but if you're knowledgeable in regards to the modern usage of him as a character, he's been all but phased out due to a film called The Problem with Apu, which calls into question whether or not Apu is a harmful stereotype. It's not really my place to say anything beyond the fact that I personally quite like Apu as a character. He's one of the more fleshed out side characters in the series, and one of the most steadfast friendly faces the family has ever had, but there are so many other characters who could easily work well in this environment. Apu was always such a weird choice to me considering he canonically spends so much time at work, and usually isn't the one dishing out violence and pain. Someone like Mo, Groundskeeper Willie, Krusty, or especially Snake Jailbird, or even Sideshow Bob, could provide a much more suitable character to cause chaos than Apu would, even if it would take some rewriting of the story to accomplish. And honestly, I see no reason that this one shouldn't receive a remake, legal issues notwithstanding, because a fan already did it. They rebuilt the game from the ground up, and it looks and allegedly plays like a dream. Unfortunate that they can't release it, but it's completely understandable given the circumstances. So can we get an official remake then?
Donkey! What's going on here?
Oh, hey, Shrek, I didn't hear you come in with all that smashing, bashing, and crashing.
Yeah, I'm 100% serious. I figure let's get the other licensed game on this list out of the way. Full disclaimer, this is the only game I've never personally gotten to play myself, but it's one that I have an odd fascination with. What originally started as an ironic joke about mixing competitive Smash with the memey potential of Shrek cultivated a genuine, if small, competitive community that soon came to discover that the title has a treasure trove of unintentional depth due to a code made of spaghetti and onions. But unlike the previous entries, I say maintain the jank and lean into it. Clean up the code to create intentional competitive maneuvers, wave dashing, lag cancelling. Lean into the power of this niche community. Use their terminology of ogre-mented combo. Just maybe nerf Red Riding Hood's Infinite. Honestly, I say springboard this into something bigger. Add new stages based on other locales in the Shrek universe. Add more fighters to the roster, like the beloved cast of surprising new cult classic Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Goldilocks, Kitty Softpaws, Jack Horner, and of course new Tumblr sexy man, Death. If there's one lesson we've learned from Melee after all this time, it's that fighting game fans love to push their games to the absolute limit, to find every hidden layer. And I say, why not go all in? Give it an online mode, tournament mode, add some bonus minigames and collectibles, add in the handheld exclusive characters, make it the definitive version of Shrek Super Slam, and get this baby at EVO. Heck, give it a season pass of guest characters from other DreamWorks titles. Skipper from Madagascar, Hiccup or Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon, Po from Kung Fu Panda, Mr. Wolf from The Bad Guys, somebody from Rise of the Guardians. I mean, if we're not getting a DreamWorks platform fighter at any point, we might as well, right? That'd be a fun roster to build, though. Shrek Soda! Sorry, that was the best I had for a transition. But in all seriousness, try not to massacre me in the comments. I know this game has an extremely passionate fanbase, and I see why. It has one of the most likable core casts in the series, the mystery is engaging, and as with all of Persona's soundtrack, the OST is superb. But I really think it could benefit from being remade from the ground up, though I'd like to make a distinction on how I'd like them to handle it. I'm not the world's biggest fan of what I call the Persona 5ification of the UI and style of Persona 3 Reload, and that's coming from a Persona 5 fanboy. Likewise, I'm not a fan of the fact they just remade the original without the canon story postgame, or even that they chose not to make the female protagonist an option. While it's great we're getting a chance to experience the story remade for modern audiences, the fact the whole story isn't there is just wrong. When I buy something, I kind of expect it to be the full experience. So I'd say remake Golden instead of the base game. The main reason I'm wanting this is for the gameplay, though while I'd like the aesthetic to remain relatively untouched, some of the quality of life changes from 5 would be greatly appreciated. The ability to baton pass to other party members, a larger list of elemental abilities, non-instant kill curse and bless skills so they could actually be useful, and more minigames to break up the action. But the gameplay isn't the only thing that warrants a change. Some of the writing hasn't exactly aged well, particularly with Yosuke and his treatment of kanji. What at the time was seen as relatively normal has become recognized for how harmful it can be, and the writer's intent can come off as messy. Basically, tone down Yosuke's gay panic jokes. But speaking of characters, I'd actually like to see the cast be given even more depth, and especially the protagonist. I understand he's supposed to be a stand-in for yourself, but supplemental material has given him so much canon character that elevates him into being, well, an actual character, and it'd be a shame to throw all that away. With some extra care in writing, maybe we could even have some alternate endings based on your choices to increase replay value. Maybe have a situation where a different character is the culprit entirely. Or maybe, considering the group is called the Investigation Team, we could actually have more gameplay related to them, well, investigating. Trying to solve it like an actual crime. Or add some post-game content where we catch up with the investigation team like a year later with an additional dungeon, or even in the future, taking place during the events of 5. Since, we're never getting a Persona 5 arena. We could at least have the cast meet in canon somehow. Just some food for thought.
But this may be our only chance. We can't let fear stop us. I'm not afraid of the darkness!
From one game about anime friendship power to another, I'll admit I feel like I'm going to alienate some people with this one. As much as I really want to play Kingdom Hearts 4 and continue the story into the next arc, I'd like almost just as much to be able to see the original title redone. It's less so much a case of awkward controls and janky combat, more so it's the fact that the game just feels so slow and heavy in comparison to later titles, and the game as a whole is much less balanced. There's no extending Keyblade combos, the amount of flashy moves is minimal, magic is so blatantly overpowered that running a strength or defense-based build is almost useless. It's just got a lot of first game syndrome. And that's not to say all my issues lie in battle. The world design is oftentimes frustrating. There's no map, and with worlds like this, it can be easy to get lost or lose focus on your current objective, especially in places like the Cave of Wonders, Monstro, and basically all of Hollow Bastion. And even if you know where you're going, a lot of the platforming is just unfun and finicky. Imagine worlds with a similar design to, say, Kingdom Hearts 3's worlds, with Sora being given a few more movement tools to make traversal easier. For example, because of the weirdness of Wonderland, maybe Sora could figure out how to run on walls in later worlds. I mean, he already kinda does this with gliding in Neverland. There are also a few elephants in the room. For one, the voice actors are much older nowadays and sound significantly different, especially Sora. Though they've kind of retconned that to imply he's always sounded the way he does currently anyway, though they'd still need to re-record the whole game's script. Then there's Deep Jungle. We get it back when the original is re-released, but I somehow doubt the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs would be willing to play ball again for this. How about instead we just replace it with the Jungle Book? It was originally intended to be included but got traded out for Tarzan during the first game, and it's never gotten a chance to shine since. So it'd make a fine replacement. You could even have a lot of similar areas. You could fight Shere Khan instead of Sabor, and Baloo or Mowgli riding on Bagheera could be party members. I always dread going back to the original when replaying the series, so this would be a nice change of pace. And for the sticklers about lore, nothing would need to be retcons other than Deep Jungle, which never gets acknowledged anyway after the first game, so no harm is done to the canon story after that point. Donald and Goofy would probably get along great here. While it may surprise you knowing how much I play Persona and Dead Rising, the honor for one of the highest amounts of time I've put into a single game is Animal Crossing New Leaf. I may not have visited my town regularly in years, but basically every day for about 4 years straight, I took a trip down to my happy little town, a comfortable place to help me relax after homework or a work day. Ever since the Switch came out, I was hoping that a new title would release and help me recapture the magic from my time in New Leaf. And yet, while New Horizons was a great game and came out at the actual perfect time for the world, I have to say, it didn't keep my attention nearly as long. While it added a lot of cool stuff by the end of its content update lifespan, a lot of my favorite aspects of New Leaf got left behind by the wayside, most notably the highest tier of the Nookling Store and Tortimer Island, complete with all the fun minigame tours. But outside of that, there's a lot of smaller details that I really liked in the predecessor that I was sad to see go. More variety in fruit, and even perfect fruits, Dr. Shrunk's Entertainment Club, minigames with your in-game Nintendo systems, villagers visiting and inviting you over more frequently, being able to work at the Roost, having to remember villagers' Toy Day wishes throughout December and the things that scare them through October, even just having the villagers address you as mayor. In a weird way, the universal freedoms given by New Horizons' crafting system, replacing the slightly less convenient methods of doing them before, such as being able to change your hair on a whim rather than visiting Harriet, make you lose out on some of the charm of the series. You don't rush in Animal Crossing. It's supposed to relax you and you're supposed to take your time. New Horizons villagers have less to say than ever before, and thus feel more wooden than previous, and the holidays feel less special due to added simplicity. You had to work for your holiday goodies in New Leaf. The whole game feels like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and this is most true about the lack of Main Street. Previously, you could check in with Leaf, Kix, and Sable every day. Now you only get to see them 1 day a week, and their stock is more limited as a result. What I'd love to see is a fully HD version of New Leaf, just with some of New Horizons additions added in, like the pole vault, ladders, crafting, farming, and Happy Home Paradise. Oh, and the part that I miss most of all, the crossover items! My house in New Leaf had every single crossover Nintendo item, and even all the Monster Hunter stuff. You could make a museum of fun Nintendo outfits and knickknacks, and it's just completely missing in New Horizons.
Lions and tigers and bears, oh my! Watch your step, it's a zoo in here! With Microsoft Zootycoon, the cagey new resource strategy game, you're in charge. What would you do to build the world's coolest zoo? Don't hold back, release your inner animal!
These animals are definitely different from the ones in the last entry. Oh, I love Zoo Tycoon. Sim and strategy games aren't usually my cup of tea, but there's something so magical about that first Zoo Tycoon game. Maybe it's just the fact that I've always loved going to the zoo, or just my fascination with animals in general, but being able to create my own zoo has always held such massive appeal to me. And yet, despite there being a sequel that's good in its own right, and a well-made spiritual successor in Planet Zoo, neither of them are quite the same. I just love that minimalist, isometric view of the OG, all the Easter eggs I discovered on my own, even the repetitive sounds and music never got old, and I still freaking love this game to this day. I had the complete collection disc when I was younger, I still have it even if the casing is in rough shape, and I would love to see a reimagining of this nostalgic title like Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition did. I'd buy it even if it was just a straight up copy with no added bells or whistles, but throw in some animals from the sequel that weren't included in the original, like beavers, peacocks, lemurs, Galapagos turtles, dodos, maybe even add the elusive, rumored dragon as one of the Easter egg mythical creatures, and let me go wild creating zoo after zoo. If I had the coding talent, I'd make the damn thing myself, because this, like Dead Rising, is one that I absolutely need in my life. When I was younger, this was my go-to game after school. I'd play for hours on end, challenging scenarios, going freeform with the infinite money cheat just to go full creative, pausing the second it turned Halloween or Christmas in-game to grab the elusive jack-o'-lantern and Christmas tree decorations, and of course, putting every single animal into one exhibit, seeing them fight to determine the king of the animal kingdom, only to be shocked that a fucking penguin came out on top. Please, Microsoft, I'll buy any Xbox consoles in the future if you give me this one game.
Thank you, Your Highness. What did you do?
I turned off the wall. Wait, didn't you turn off the whole movie? I must have pressed the wrong button. Well, put it back on. Put the movie back on. Yes, sir. You gotta get that thing fixed. We're back.
Before we get to the last entries, which I imagine to be the spiciest takes I have on offer here, I want to quickly bring up a few honorable mentions that I just don't have the same depth of scope to offer in what a remake could entail. The first is the original Devil May Cry, which, if I were to guess, might actually have the highest chance here of happening. It's not that the game is necessarily bad so much as it has some outdated attributes that could stand being changed, the biggest in my opinion being the classic Resident Evil style camera. While I understand some people enjoy the constantly shifting perspective, personally, these types of games always make me feel weird when focusing, because the direction I was just pressing no longer functions the way I want it to, even though it did a second ago. It's a disconnect between my muscle memory and what my eyes are seeing, and I personally don't care for it. This is a recurring problem with Kamiya's later work, such as Bayonetta, which would be changed up for the sequel. Of course, it goes without saying that a remake could up the ante on graphics, and seeing OG Dante in glorious HD would do some wonders. You could also stand to redo the sequel, but maybe just rewrite the whole thing though. Dante is so completely out of character, the story's not really super great, and the gameplay could stand some improvements. DMC 3 and beyond are all pretty solid, so just take what you learned in those games and apply it to the first two. Next, there's littlebigplanet, and this one's entirely for two reasons. First, have you seen Sackboy: A Big Adventure? It's one of the most gorgeous games I've ever seen, rivaled only by maybe Psychonauts 2, base game Mario Kart 8, and Bayonetta Origins. I just want to see the assets brought into the modern era. The other reasons are that several of the games are stuck on PS3, and for some reason, Sony doesn't like bringing their legacy titles forward each generation anymore, which is equally true of my last honorable mention, the original Slycooper trilogy. I love these games, but despite the fact that the cel-shaded look has kept them more aesthetically pleasing than other games of their generation, a full makeover in HD could make them as stunning as Wind Waker HD. But I don't just want an upscale. For as much as I love these games, they each have something that the others lack. Sly is more touchy and hard to control in the first game, but the levels are much more tightly designed. I vastly prefer having a larger hub area like in the later titles, though their platforming is much less precise and intuitive than the first game. All of them have their strengths. If they could take from each other to create the idealized version of themselves, we could have the pinnacle of stealth platforming. Alright, with those out of the way, which fanbase do I piss off first?
Oh yeah! This is happening!
Can't wait for the seas of salt and threats to my children and my children's children to begin over this one. Yes, it's true. I did not care for the Sonic Adventure games. They insist upon themselves. In all seriousness, what many call the best Sonic games to me just come off as janky messes. Yeah, the story's relatively fun, and the music is great, but that's Sonic music. It's not exactly a high bar to pass. Honestly, the worst parts of these games are a symptom of over-ambition for the time. They wanted every playable character to have a different playstyle in the first game, and the second made 3 distinct playstyles that, while better balanced, still contribute to level design that I personally find unfun to navigate, which is the biggest failure a platformer can have outside of the controls. And hoo boy, those controls can be rough, especially with Sonic and Shadow. Sometimes they move so fast you can overshoot your target easily, especially when using the homing attack, yet they somehow manage to turn on a dime? Maybe I'm just spoiled, but later 3D Sonic titles, such as the excellent Sonic Generations, managed to make the speed feel relatively natural while minimizing the amount of annoying deaths with more creative and branching level design. But it's not just Sonic and Shadow that have their problems, no. Tails in the first game might as well skip the majority of his levels, and somehow, despite similar playstyles, they managed to make Gamma's levels in the first game too short, and the mech character levels in the sequel too long. Not to mention taking a step back with the Knuckles and Rouge levels, making you find the Emerald Shards in a specific order, and since the locations are randomized, you may find yourself tracking back all the way to the start of the level again. Then there's Big. As someone who likes fishing in games, I still can't stand big segments because I just don't like the way the fishing is implemented, and it breaks the pace of the rest of the game's natural flow of progression. The boss encounters with other playable characters are just straight up unfun, and the collision detection, both of them, and oftentimes the level geometry themselves, can be an exercise in frustration. A remade duology rebuilt with love, though, could help them reclaim their titles as some of Sonic's best work, for all that's worth nowadays. Plus, same song and dance as all the other colorful animal mascot games. The graphics could look so much prettier, brighter, and colorful. Though I will admit, it would be a shame to remove Sonic's independently moving parts of his face, as those are some of the most hilarious moments in gaming, watching his eyes, mouth, and eyebrows squash and stretch without rhyme or reason. But in order to make it work, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for the greater good. Alright, put your pitchforks and torches down, I can explain. I'm not saying that Ocarina of Time isn't an incredible game with some fantastic highs and minimal lows, but I am saying that there are a lot of kinks that could be ironed out with a modern reimagining. For example, there's Hyrule Field. Back in the day, you'd leave Kokiri Forest to see this massive world open to you, with Hyrule Field as the connecting location. But outside of Lon Lon Ranch, there's basically nothing to do in the field. It exists purely for the function of connecting locales together. I mean, yeah, there are enemies to fight, but what's the point in doing so? It doesn't cause you to get stronger, and the enemies aren't fast enough to stop you from just running past them. And unlike in later titles, there's not even really any incentive to fight them unless you're grinding for rupees or drops. It should say a lot that speedrunners basically have to force the game into bugging out to make the constant trips through this area faster. It's just a lot of unnecessary running back and forth. Being able to have fast travel points alone would cut down on the length of the game significantly. Some of the dungeons have some rather obnoxious criteria for getting through them, worst of all being Jabu Jabu's belly and the water temple, just for having to carry Ruto around in the former and the constant need to change the water level in the latter. The amount of golden Skulltulas is way too large for me to want to collect them all, despite the fact that I'd like to see that side quest through, and Epona's usage is super limited. She exists to get to other places faster, but can barely be used outside of Hyrule Field. It's wasted potential. Basically, I'd like to see a true open-world version of Ocarina of Time, with more places Epona can roam, no loading zones outside of maybe dungeon entrances, and just more incentive to want to fight enemies, more side quests, but less golden Skulltulas. Maybe the ability to use the hookshot just about anywhere to create new paths for finishing up dungeons in different manners. If the Metroid series can embrace the power of sequence breaking, why can't Zelda? And for those hardcores that love the original, be it just for the nostalgia or for speedrunning purposes, we're not taking it away, this would just be a remixed way to experience a beloved classic. And that's really the takeaway here. I don't want these games to replace their original versions, but to exist alongside them, make them more accessible, let a new generation experience them for the first time, or give the people who grew up with them a chance to experience them sort of for the first time again. There's definitely merit to taking another shot at a bad game, but for my money, the best remakes amplify what made the original great while enhancing the game in new and innovative ways. But what about you? What games would you like to see remade? Are there any on my list you'd like to see? Any you disagree with? Please let me know in the comments. And if you like what you saw here today, maybe leave a like, and subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an upload from me, or maybe follow me on Twitter at IncarnateNerd. And hey, if you're interested, my channel has been approved for YouTube memberships, so if you just can't get enough and want to directly support the channel, you'll receive some perks like having your name featured at the end of the video. But with all that out of the way, my name's been Gigi, the Nerd Incarnate, and I'd love to hear from you. I hope to see you in the next video, and I hope you have an incredible day. Peace out.